Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Whoops. Okay, a little screw up in the technical opening of the show. I think that part actually goes out over the air, too. But I made some adjustments so that we could get started on time. Didn't want to lose 30 seconds of the show because we'll need it all for something. I mean, trust me, at the end of the show, I'll be like, if I had 30 more seconds, I could have done this right. So this time I decided to not do it right up front. So I guess there's no excuses for a poor ending of the show. So we'll get around to why that happens later on, once it does happen. Anyway, we got the show itself started on time. What happened? I was reading... Well, what do you think was happening? I was reading something. What was I reading? Well, of course I was reading, everybody, the congressional record from August 6th, 1993. What were you doing? Right, probably nothing quite so spectacular as that. I was doing that because the argument continues right up to the moment, I'm sure, that we take the votes, and I don't know when they're coming in the Senate because we never know where anything is coming in the Senate, but people arguing back and forth over what's going to happen or what would happen if somebody tried to force through the minimum wage provisions under the reconciliation bill, or under the reconciliation process that they're using to pass the COVID relief bill in, well, both houses, but it only really matters very much in the Senate. And there's a very weird situation that's arising. Greg made mention of it a few days ago, and I'm still not really 100% clear on how this thing is supposed to work. I mean, I think I have a pretty good understanding of how it really should work, but I'm not certain that the precedents argue in exactly the same way. But it won't change much, as the approach that Democrats are taking to the inclusion of the minimum wage provisions in the reconciliation bill won't bring us to the scenario that enthusiasts originally, or I don't know whether they originally envisioned it, but they envisioned it in the last couple of days. The spectacular ignoring of the parliamentarian and ruling from the chair. For whatever reason, they still prefer that Vice President Kamala Harris come and deliver this ruling, though there's no requirement that it be her. It can be any presiding officer. But a scenario envisioned in which the presiding officer rules not simply that, well, rules simply that the Byrd rule provisions don't apply to the inclusion of the minimum wage hike provisions in the bill, and just simply says, all right, well, the parliamentarian is wrong that the Byrd rule applies, and then therefore wrong in applying the Byrd rule and saying that the material would have to come out if a point of order were made. Ordinarily, what would happen if no one ignores the parliamentarian, you would have the parliamentarian advising the chair to rule that a point of order against inclusion of the minimum wage provisions would run afoul of the Byrd rule, and therefore it would come out, and what the body might then decide to do is say, well, we can entertain a motion to waive the Byrd rule and include this material anyway, but the waiver vote would require 60 votes to make effective. But then, if you were to ignore the parliamentarian's advice and simply say, I find that the Byrd rule doesn't apply, the Republicans, presumably, or anyone who opposed including this material under, well, for any reason, but if they were willing to cite the Byrd rule, could make a point of order saying, no, this ruling is incorrect. I appeal the ruling of the chair. And ordinarily, an appeal of the ruling of the chair, an appeal can be sustained and the chair be overruled with a majority vote. But the claim is that because this would be a ruling that the Byrd rule does not apply, and the appeal would essentially be arguing that the Byrd rule does apply, that it would, for some reason, require 60 votes in favor of the or an opposition to the appeal. It's a very weird thing. And so the idea was, there's a memo apparently that I have not seen, but it's circulating, that claims that this is a possible workaround, that only 40-something votes, in order to prevent there being 60 on the other side, only 40-something votes would need to be mustered by Democrats in order to get us into the position whereby a 60-vote majority to apply to overrule the ruling of the chair with respect to a question of the Byrd rule would be able to be mustered. And I got to tell you, that does sound upside down and backwards. But the real question is there any precedent that interprets things this way? And it is claimed that there is. And I see it, and it is difficult to get your head around while you're trying. Well, the real problem is it's difficult to get your head around while you're supposed to be pushing buttons to play the the music to properly introduce the show. So I might be able to limp my way through it at some point and discuss why it is the people think that this is the case, and whether or not the August 6th, everyone can go check it themselves, August 6th, 1993 precedents really bear this out. I'm not certain that they do, but in any case, it wouldn't matter one way or another unless the Democrats in the Senate plan to put someone in the chair who will provide the necessary ruling, and it seems that they have no such plans. So, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of worth exploring in theory, but if it's not going to happen, I can't waste too much time on it. It's already been 8 minutes now, and it's time to pay attention to some things that are actually happening. Greg Dworkin is here so that we can begin that review now. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. We're doing just fine. So Chuck Schumer said yesterday, quote,
Yes.
as early as tomorrow, that would be today, the Senate will begin work on the American Rescue Plan. Remember, that's the name, the American Rescue Plan.
It's very American.
The fact is that the Senate has progressives and moderates, and they're wrestling over exactly what to do with the version that the House sent over. And despite the demands, claims, and other suggestions that parliamentarian tricks be involved here, it's not happening. So what's going to happen is everybody's going to step back and say, you can do this, you can do that. There's other things you could do. There are arcane things you can do. There are obvious things you could do. But if you don't have the votes, none of it's happening. And so that's what's the situation in the Senate.
Yeah. That's the big problem, is that you can even if you could arrange to get past it in parliamentary fashion, then the thing comes to a vote, and if a majority of senators don't vote for a package that's got this in, or to vote to include it in the package, then it doesn't happen, and we're not really there at the moment. So
right. When you have a 50-50 majority plus one, then basically what the Democrats are doing is they have to be perfect to get anything done. And that's just the way it is. You have to completely have your 50 in line. Yeah. And if you lose one of them, then you have to have either a situation where the vice president sitting in the chair as president of the Senate can, in fact, break a tie, or you have to somehow entice one Republican to join you. Yes, you can see how that works in clear and crystal clarity when it comes to cabinet appointments, right? Neera Tanden will not be OMB head. Deborah Haaland is likely to be the Interior Secretary. How do we know this? Because this morning Susan Collins said, I'm voting for her.
Right. Yes.
And her excuse, I mean, it's always, everything's an excuse. First you decide what to do, and then you decide what your excuse is. Her excuse is a good one, which is, I spoke to Deb Haaland. I think she'll be bipartisan, but more importantly, she appreciates Acadia National Park. Now, if you're from Maine, that's a big deal. If you've ever vacationed there, it's a big deal.
It's a nice
one of the
place.
most beautiful spots
Who
on
doesn't?
earth, and it's nice. That's not why she's voting for her,
Yeah,
but
right.
it's a nice thing to say.
Sure. I mean, I don't believe that the park was ever in any danger or anything. So
Well, and it needs upkeep, and it needs support. It used to be
It's
run by the
$10 to
Rockefellers,
sweep the place
but
up.
they kind of ran out of money and they kind of donated it to the United States, and so now it's our problem to keep it up. And so it's good to support it. It has many visitors, and because of the millions of people that go through the park, it always needs upkeep. The trails fall apart, rock erodes, you get weathering and this and that and everything else. Fine. But the point is that while Joe Manchin's thinking about what to do, they've got Susan Collins' vote, and that makes all the difference in the world. So that's why Lisa Murkowski and Joe Manchin and Susan Collins are going to turn out to be the power brokers in this Senate. And you don't have to like it, but you do have to recognize, as some people have been writing, there's the Senate you want and then there's the Senate you have. And with the Senate that you have, that's what you have to do. So one of the big stories, of course, is the fact that the American Rescue Plan, the coronavirus relief plan, is on track to start getting started, at least in the Senate. Yes. The big story, of course, is vaccine. Joe Biden announcing that by the end of May, there'll be enough vaccine to give everybody in America, any adult in America who wants it, vaccination. Yes. And maybe by the end of this month, the teachers and school personnel might be at least getting one shot, and that will help the grade schools, the elementary schools at least, reopen. There's a nice piece along those lines in the New York Times today, in their own words, why health experts say elementary schools should open. And it's a matter of the amount of virus in the community, as we've been discussing on the show, wearing masks, and also having some decent ventilation. Now, all those conditions can't be met everywhere, and the CDC is probably a little bit more restrictive than some of the public health and infectious disease experts are. But nonetheless, that's coming. So you could see things that are happening in the country that are actually good news. The presence of vaccine, the reopening of elementary schools, increased business. You're looking at a coronavirus boom that Biden's going to get credit for. Unfortunately, there are some people, like in Mississippi and Texas, where the governors are doing this a little bit too fast. But it's probably not going to be the disaster that it was the first time they did it. It's just going to be a minor setback, except the variants are a curveball, and so we don't know. So everybody's advising them not to do this. I'm not predicting doom. I think that there's a lot about the virus we still don't know, and the trajectory of what's going to happen that we still don't know. But it's still a bad move. Just may not be the disaster that people are painting it out to be. But bad is bad enough. In other words, look and see where we are with the virus right now. The number of virus cases in the country is significantly lower than it was a month ago, but we've plateaued at a higher level than we were since last summer, and that's not good. And is that because of the variants, or is that because of people like Abbott and DeSantis and Tate Reeves and other governors, Kristi Noem, the governor of Iowa? I mean, there's certain places where for political reasons the public health folks are being ignored, and that's not good. So it's a good news, bad news sort of situation where things are starting to get under control, and as a result, the politicians who simply cannot stand to have a good thing go without trying to screw it up are doing their best to screw it up in order to try to get credit for what's happening naturally.
Okay. Or get credit for screwing it up later, I suppose. If they...
Well, you know, see Sweden. Things look good in the beginning, and then after a while, people start writing, this is really a bad idea. And while Biden is getting more vaccine available and promising more vaccine, as if all of public policy, because we forget this after 4 years of Trump, all of public policy isn't a matter of what you promise. That's right. Easy for reporters to follow. Okay, you made this promise. Now we get to see whether or not you did this promise. But policy isn't promises. Policy is, here's what our goals are, and then here's how we're going to get there, and then you can judge us as to whether or not we get there. Not quite the same thing as a promise. It's not a gotcha. So as the Biden administration works on policy to get more vaccine available and announces what their moving the goalpost guidelines are, because with more information comes moving, and that's fine. While Biden is doing that, he's also involved in brokering through the Defense Production Act a collaboration between rivals, Johnson & Johnson, who have the vaccine but can't produce enough of it, and Merck, a major player in the vaccine field. I think they make 11 out of the 19 infectious disease vaccines, but theirs was a failure on coronavirus. They have the manufacturing capability and size, but not the vaccine. J&J has the vaccine, but not the manufacturing capability and the size. So Biden brokered a deal between those two companies where Merck will help Johnson & Johnson manufacture Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, which is pretty good. And so as a result, Johnson & Johnson's one shot doesn't need to be super cool refrigerated vaccine will now be made 24 hours a day and be more readily available than it otherwise would have. Partly this happened because Johnson & Johnson was underproducing and underdelivering, and the Biden administration was all over them, trying to get them to admit that they were not up to what was going on here. They promised 37 million doses. They said, okay, we can only deliver 20. Biden said, that's not good enough. Why don't you work with these other people and get it done? They did. It is. And so that's the announcement that Biden made yesterday, which is great. And while this is going on, while he's talking about opening up schools, and CDC has new guidance about what people who are fully vaccinated should do in terms of getting together indoors without masks, that should be out today, if not tomorrow. While all of this is going on, the Republicans are arguing about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head. And that gives you a pretty good idea of where American politics are right now.
Yes, but something. Yeah, well, I mean, Mr. Potato Head is a huge deal, apparently. I don't know. It seems to occupy all of their thoughts, which is, I guess, why we didn't have
Susan
vaccine
Collins wants to know, are these Maine potatoes?
They seem smaller. Yeah, these seem like genuine Idaho, like big-time potatoes. But, yeah, that has occupied all of their time, and just like... well, I'm golfing. I can't be bothered to use the Defense Production Act. Or the 5 times that Trump said he was going to use the Defense Production Act, and then just didn't do it. And that's one of those things that the reporter should follow up on. Like, hey, he promised that. Are any of the gears turning? No. Oh, weird. That's weird.
For those of you who haven't heard, the estate of Dr. Seuss decided that they are not going to publish 6 Dr. Seuss books anymore because there's racist imagery. Some of those books are like 100 years old.
I mean, they go back a ways.
To think it all happened on Mulberry Street is like, almost a century old. And so some of the images at that time, depicting Africans and Indians and Orientals is not acceptable by 21st century culture. So the estate, not the government,
yes, all right.
The owner of the creative license decided not to publish those books. So that's what's happening on the Dr. Seuss side. And Mr. Potato Head, in terms of gender issues, is happening on the Mr. Potato Head side. Let me explain the salience of these things. Okay. Christopher Wray had a widely publicized hearing televised yesterday about the January 6th insurrection. For those of us who are following along, we learned nothing new. But on national television, Christopher Wray said, it really wasn't Antifa. These are white supremacists and militia people.
Yes, right. The right
As answer. He was saying that, Fox News cuts away to the Dr. Seuss controversy. That is the salience of talking about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head. Every single time something comes up, like the COVID response or the vaccines, or Christopher Wray saying, it was white nationalists who were doing this, not Antifa or Antifa or the National Organization of Anarchists,
Mr. Potato
or the Tooth Fairy, or anybody else who you would mythically like to present as the reason for the January 6th insurrection. Whenever that comes up, they break away and start talking about Dr. Seuss. So that's how they keep their audience misinformed, uninformed, And that's why so many Republicans are convinced that Antifa was behind the January 6th insurrection, now that they've accepted that there, in fact, was a January 6th insurrection. That part, at least, is done. It's going to take a little longer for it to sink in that these are white militias and white nationalists who are doing this. But, if they start talking about it and trying to get that news out, then conservatives and Fox News in particular are going to change. Oh, yeah? What about Andrew Cuomo and Dr. Seuss?
Yeah, I guess that's where they go with it. I'll have to find that thing. There was
that's
Onion
called "What About
it?" saying,
and that's just people need to be aware. So don't take it seriously, but do take it literally.
Yeah, I guess you have to. Right, somewhere I'll find it here. The Onion had the insurrectionist truther doesn't believe he was at the Capitol. That wraps the whole thing up kind of nicely. So yeah, that's the distraction they're using, and for some reason it's just sort of morphed. Some reason they just decided to lie. Not only are these things are happening, in a sense, but these are private decisions by the owners of the material in question, and there's nothing you can do about that. They said we want to rename our product in the Mr. Potato Head section, and over in the Dr. Seuss section, we don't feel like publishing this anymore, and we're the only ones who have the right to make that decision. But that got the reason Fox is interested is because Republicans, right? Republicans, though, were willing to get up and say Democrats are doing this, so that makes it newsworthy for Fox. Democrats are not doing this, so par for the course for Fox News coverage. But all right, well now I think everybody knew that already, but still, I think it would be a failure not to mention these things. So now we've succeeded. Right. That's excellent.
So Scott Gottlieb was on CNBC this morning and said, we have about another month to go. And I know people are frustrated, he said, but things are going to open up in the next 3 to 4 weeks in terms of the availability of vaccine. So within a month, it's going to get much better than it is right now. Now, Connor Sen, reporter, says, I've heard some people say it's too bad Gottlieb isn't in the administration, but I think he's able to speak more freely and accurately outside of it. And my friend Dr. Ed from Massachusetts, ICU guy and research specialist, says, I especially appreciate his views because he knows what Pfizer knows. Gottlieb's on the Pfizer board.
Oh.
And that relationship couldn't exist if he's back in the government. So with Gottlieb being on the board of Pfizer, a very prominent spokesperson, but not in the government, he gets to say what he wants to say without having anybody look over his shoulder. So you're getting some pretty good information from him. He's, and I've said this multiple times, he's probably the only person I could think of. And people have some of the whistleblowers in mind, but in terms of just simply doing his job, he's probably the only person in the Trump administration who came out with his reputation intact.
Okay. Very few. Very few.
Very few to the point where I can't think of anybody else unless you're a whistleblower and your reputation is enhanced for whistleblowing. Yes. So other than that, we do have those. It's and there's a handful of those, and they deserve credit for doing what they're doing. But most everybody else pretty much disgraced, and that's why it's just so interesting watching Republicans take the no position on everything that has to do with the COVID relief bill. So an interesting observation about that, several. I think I'll do David Shore after the break because it's longer. But Perry Bacon, writing in 538, has a piece where the title and just this little snippet kind of tell you everything you need to know. Why Republicans don't fear an electoral backlash for opposing really popular parts of Biden's agenda.
Okay.
And he gives several reasons. But he says, put it another way, the opposition party can guarantee a lack of bipartisan support and then criticize the president for lacking bipartisan support.
Yes, right. They are in control of that.
Right. And so, and of course, that the D.C. press will pick up on that. We're not going to judge Biden policy on whether or not it's successful in hitting policy goals. We're going to judge Biden policy based on the politics of whether or not it gets Republican votes in Congress, because that's much easier for us to count, and we can publish right away. And so we can say, well, Biden said he was going to be bipartisan, but he didn't get any Republican votes on this COVID bill, even though it passed with bare majorities on both sides, because both majority leaders, Speaker of the House and the majority leader in the Senate, are actually pretty good at what they do. Well, we can't say that.
Yeah.
So we're going to say, oh, look, he said it was bipartisan, but it's not. And I would say, oh, you want to do the politics? The politics is they got this done with a bare majority of 50+1 in the Senate.
Yeah.
So, that's the politics. You want to talk about whether or not it's bipartisan? It has bipartisan support from the country.
That's true. And we have
right?
And at least lean on that.
And along those lines, people are still talking about the fact that Trump went to CPAC and didn't get 100% support from CPAC in running again.
Oh,
and
yes.
that's important. He there's even a piece in the Hill on it, of all things, the congressional rag that sometimes tweets 17 times a day and has a distinctly center-right lean, says nonetheless, Trump may look like a rock star now, but his position's actually fading. And he doesn't have Twitter, and he doesn't have a platform, and it remains to be seen how salient he will be for the rest of the party. Trumpism is here to stay, but whether or not he as a particular figure is around or not, he has only one thing. And Jonathan Bernstein wrote about this. Trump has only one card to play, and that is turning on his own party.
Yeah,
right?
He is doing it.
He could pull out and do another party. He could stay in and start to campaign against people within the Republican Party and bring whatever of his voters will go along.
Right.
That's the threat to Republicans. It's the only thing he has over their head. But to them, that's still a potent club. And so that's why he's not faded completely. That doesn't mean the general public wants anything to do with him.
Yeah, well, he can still frighten Republicans into believing they'll face a primary from the right or from some kook somewhere. I guess that's still a potent force. All right, that's all he's got. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Abby's here. Yes, we took care of the request of our good Twitter friend Ride the Curve here asking me to close my laundry room door. It's actually Abby is doing it. I mean, I don't know if I can sit here and blame it on Greg, but yeah, the laundry is not near us, but it is near Greg, and that happens from time to time. The door's closed now, but Abby got through it. So, all right, we'll have that to deal with.
Out of the door and wanted to be outside.
Abby was in the dryer and said,
"Try this at home, folks.
The hell, and cut my nails, damn it." All right. So yeah, these things happen from time to time, and as it turns out, I waited until the break to mention it, and so did Ride the Curve here. But as it turns out, we had enough wire leeway to have done it right in the middle of the show, except no one wanted to talk about it. So, okay,
yeah,
got it.
So Greg Sargent has a piece. Biden's next big move could deliver a crippling blow to Trumpism.
Right, by putting it in a drawer.
Which is the optimistic way of looking at it. Then we'll do David Short, who has the pessimistic way of looking at it. In a revealing moment at the Conservative Political Action Conference,
that's CPAC.
Otherwise known as CPAC,
right.
Governor Ron DeSantis unintentionally displayed one of their incoherent ideology's most serious weaknesses. We can sit around and have academic debates about conservative policy, DeSantis said, but the question is, when the Klieglags get hot, when the left comes after you, will you stay strong or will you fold?
Fold.
Now, this suggestion provides Democrats with a big opening. Basically, if Biden delivers on infrastructure, on vaccines, and the economy opens and we have a boom, then it highlights the failures of Trumpism and provides an opening for people to appreciate what the Democrats are doing.
Okay.
Right? So that's the hope. The problem is that's not how people vote. That's where David Shore comes in. He's got a piece, he's interviewed in a piece in New York Magazine in the Intelligencer section.
All right.
By Eric Mitz. David Shore and Why Trump Was Good for the GOP and How Democrats Can Win in 2022.
All right.
And he looks at the 2020 election and the 2016 election and makes some very salient observations. So a voter's level of educational attainment, whether they had a college degree, became more predictive of which party they voted for in 2020 more than it had been in 2016, while the voter's racial identity became less predictive.
All right.
Which is to say, we know this. We know, for example, in Florida, in Texas, and all over the country, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx voters voted more Republican than we expected.
Yes, that did happen, I think, at least in some places.
Happened. Right. And so basically, there are conservative non-white voters who traditionally vote Democratic that if you give them an issue that makes them want to vote more Republican, they will.
They can
and you can't assume, based on racial polarization, they'll stick with the Democratic Party. If you're a conservative person of who's non-white, you may find defund the police an offensive concept.
Okay.
I guess you that if you
places.
Want to close down businesses in order to prevent everybody from dying in the middle of a pandemic, and you're an essential worker with no way of working from home and no rainy day fund to fall back on, you may find that opening up is more attractive than staying closed.
Yes.
So you may wind up voting for the Republican Party, even though Democrats expected you to do otherwise. And thinking that policy is automatically going to make you vote Democratic isn't necessarily so, which is one of the reasons why the moderates have such difficult time with the progressives and vice versa. Just because a policy appeals to college whites doesn't mean it appeals to other people.
Right.
And so whether you talk, if you want to spend all of your time talking about forgiving student loans for a whole cadre of people who didn't go to college and think it's going to work for their votes, you might be wrong. Just as an example. Now, it may be broader, more popular, but is it popular in the areas that you need votes? So this is why looking at individual voting groups is so important, and one of the things David Shore does for a living. Okay. And he says one important thing to know about the decline in Hispanic support for Democrats is that it was pretty broad. It wasn't about Cubans in South Florida. It happened in New York, California, Arizona, Texas, Colombians, Venezuelans. For the story with Hispanics overall, one thing that really comes out very clearly in survey data that we've done is that it really comes down to ideology. So when you look at self-reported ideology, just asking people, do you identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative, you find there aren't very big racial divides. The same proportion of African American, Hispanic, and white voters identify as conservative. But white voters are polarized in ideology, and non-white voters haven't been. Something like 80% of white conservatives vote for Republicans, but historically Democrats have won non-white conservatives often by very large margins. And what happened in 2020 is that non-white conservatives voted for Republicans at higher rates. They started voting more like white conservatives. And this leads to a question of why. Why did non-white voters start more sorting by ideology? And that's a hard thing to know. But David Shore's organization and our partner organizations have done extensive post-election surveys, and we look specifically at those voters who switched from Clinton to Trump, Clinton in 2016 to Trump in 2020, to see whether anything distinguishes this subgroup. And what we found is that Clinton voters with conservative views on crime, policing, and public safety were far more likely to switch to Trump than voters with less conservative views on these issues. And having conservative views on these issues was more predictive of switching from Clinton to Trump than having conservative views on any other issue. And this lines up pretty well with trends we saw during the campaign. In the summer, Following the emergence of defund the police as a nationally salient issue, support for Biden among Hispanics declined. So I think you can tell this micro story. We raised the salience of an ideologically charged issue that millions of non-white voters disagreed with us on, and as a result, these conservative Hispanic voters who've been voting with us despite their ideological inclinations, starting voting like conservative whites.
Okay.
So that's how he's identifying the issue, and that's relevant for 2022, obviously, where Trump will not be on the ballot. And so the question on the table then is, how do you get these folks to vote again for you if Trump isn't on the ballot, changing the perception of why you vote for people? Mm-hmm. And, in other words, Biden didn't campaign on police abolition. Why did that make people vote for the Republican? And Shor says, well, the decline was large. Nationwide, 9% or so, up to 14 to 15% in Florida, voted Republican. 1 in 10 Hispanic voters switched. And that's beyond the margin of what can plausibly be changed by investing more in Spanish media. So it isn't a question of, we have to do Spanish radio ads earlier. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah, all right. I assumed that it would be more work than that. And it was, that's always a good assumption, that you can't just change the ads and that fixes the whole thing. But this was an early, or the problem was identified earlier, certainly. But the part about, okay, well, what do you do about it was the part that was missing.
Right. So
okay.
he's
Gotcha.
just being practical here. He says, look, if a majority of non-white people agreed with liberals on all the issues, the fundamental problem would be different. But Democrats have been relying on the support of 90% of black voters and 70% of Hispanic voters.
Yes.
Right? It's the 30-70-90 rule. Get 30% of whites, 70% of Hispanics, and 90% of blacks, and you win.
Yeah.
People have said that for many, many elections. But if Democrats elevate issues or theories that a large minority of non-white voters reject, it's going to be really hard to keep those margins.
Yeah.
Right?
True.
So you either have to work on the 90-70, or you're going to have to work and do something to get the white voters to come back and join you. And do you trust white voters?
Yeah. No, I don't.
The majority of white voters tend to vote for Republicans.
Yeah, that's the problem with them.
So what do you do? So he's just identifying the issue without giving solutions, but people need to understand that that's what's going on here. So you can't simply say, well, if you simply do this thing that I want, what about the minimum wage? What if it turns out that the minimum wage is extremely popular across a lot of different areas, but it also means that unemployment increases, which it does, because there's always trade-offs.
All right.
Less poverty, but increased unemployment. Right? You can't assume
Thinking about
that because that's the way you see it, and that's the trade-off you want, everybody will agree with that.
That's certainly true.
So it's popular, but the moderates in the Senate, at least, are looking back and saying, okay, but in my area that I represent, people feel otherwise, or I think people feel otherwise, or maybe I just feel otherwise, even though the data says otherwise. It's going to be really hard to convince all Democrats to be unanimous on this issue. And yet unanimity in the Senate is essential if you wish to pass anything. I'm simply pointing that out. And that's why the countercurrents here are just so difficult.
Yes, although that gives me the opportunity to shoehorn in one comment I meant to make the last time this came up. Unanimity among Democrats is important because of the split in the Senate and because you cannot rely on any one of the 50 Republicans to simply do the right thing and vote for the thing that's popular and helpful. That's the big problem.
Right. So immigration reform is a classic example of what we think is right. But at the same time, you have to expect the Hispanic community to vote similarly to the non-Hispanic community on this. And so just because kids are in cages doesn't automatically mean, okay, well, those people are going to vote for you.
Certainly not
because you've brought out that issue and you think you're going to do something about it.
Yeah.
There are lots of Hispanic voters who want strict rules about who comes in and who doesn't come in.
Yeah. In the absence of data, it's not a bad guess, but now we have data.
Right. Now, it's also true that the party in power tends to lose in the first mid-year election.
Usually
that's historical
true, yes.
fact. And Shore says the good news is there's a strong case for thinking this time might be different. I'm not a macroeconomist, but it seems like Biden might preside over a post-corona and economic boom. Already, Biden's approval rating is very strong. The best predictor of how a midterm is going to go is how popular the president is. So for now, everything looks about as good as you could hope for. But there's no margin for error.
Yeah.
If we conduct ourselves the way we did after 2008, we're going to lose. And due to the way that our electoral system works, we really could be locked out of power for a very long time, just like we were after 2010. So that means the need for messaging discipline is stronger than ever. But keeping the national conversation focused around popular economic issues won't be enough, since the maps in the House of Representatives are so biased against us. If we don't pass a redistricting reform, our chance of keeping the House is low. And then the Senate is even more biased against us than the House. So it's also very important we add as many states as we can. And even if we have an exceptionally good midterm, the most likely outcome is we lose 1 or 2 Senate seats. And then into 2024, we have something like 7 or 8 Democrats who are in states that are more Republican in the country overall. Basically, we have this small window right now to pass redistricting reform and create states. And if we don't, we'll almost certainly lose control of the federal government. That's his view. That's why he's the pessimist.
Well, yes, it is very pessimistic. It may not come to pass that way, but it is still true that that's the historical trend. But
right. Well, go back to what Perry Bacon was talking about. When you do popular things, that doesn't necessarily help you get votes.
Sometimes.
It'd be nice if it did, but people don't vote based on policy. So if you do something bad, people might vote against you. But if you do something good, you don't necessarily get credit for it. So we'll have to see what happens if Biden remains popular and opens things up and the coronavirus boom actually happens, just like with the pandemic itself, which was certainly a contributing factor to Trump losing, even though he's the incumbent. Everybody's theory about how politics works was upended by the pandemic in ways that were difficult to predict, including, for example, the split between I need businesses to open even though I know it's wrong, so I'm voting for the people who open it because I need the money. You can't always predict how these things are going to shake out. Well, 500,000, 500,000, people, 513,000 people have died in this country because of the coronavirus pandemic. By the way, that's approaching the estimated 675,000 that died in the great flu pandemic in 1918. The country was smaller, and so that had a bigger impact. If you population adjust, the great influenza was worse, but we're not done with this one yet. There might yet be another wave based on variants. It's a big deal. It affects society in ways that the politicians who say, okay, well, putting that aside, let's look at, everything. You can't put it aside. It's just so ingrained into everything. But at the same time, it's in unpredictable ways. So this might be different than usual because the coronavirus boom might be something that just doesn't typically happen. And yet we have all of these uncertainties and no margin for error, just like we have no margin for error in the House, no margin for error in the Senate. It's important that Biden gets these things done, and it's important that Democrats stay on message. So that's how I'm putting all of these articles together in terms of where we're at politically.
Okay, interesting.
And while we're doing that and working on trying to get stuff done, the Republicans are talking about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head because they're trying to keep their base uninformed. And the question is going to be, some of these issues are so big, that might not happen. In past years, Republicans and conservatives focused on things like Acorn and whether or not that was responsible for inappropriate electioneering, and that could work in the absence of something else going on. But with the pandemic, I don't know that issues like Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head are going to be enough to help them. They start with an advantage, as David Shore and everybody else in the world notes. But the pandemic and the recovery with it and what's going on in schools is so pervasive and involves so much of everybody's everyday life, from funerals to weddings, that I don't know that they can hide behind Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head forever.
Right, and well, I don't think changing the name of Mr. Potato Head will help with that. They can't hide just because of that. Still, they seem pretty well addicted to it. I just suppose they want to distract from whatever's going on. But I guess I'm struck by this whole thing about even the possibility that a recovery from an economic recovery after post-pandemic. It's just so it's I don't know. It seems so rare that the press would say, well, there's the possibility that the incumbent might not get credit, the incumbent party in power, that is, for an economic recovery, when that's an article of faith and always has been, and it seems to always apply to Republicans anyway. Trump is very highly unpopular and yet may win election if the fundamentals are strong. I mean, all over the place. There's no avoiding that reporting. And here we are now saying, oh, well, now the Democrats might actually get credit for an economic recovery. Guess what? There's a possibility that you might not get credit for it because people don't always vote based on policy successes. They vote, tribally or whatever it is. And wow, okay, it seems odd that the automatic advantage of an economic recovery would disappear when we stand to benefit from it, but okay. There's always room for contrarian analysis, and whatever might explain it. If there's a failure at the voting booth next time around, simply claiming that we were supposed to win because of the economic fundamentals won't help, certainly. But I don't know. I suppose be prepared for anything. That's the role of the pessimist.
I think when you step back and look at the trajectory of the pandemic and where that's going, I think some of the bigger questions still remain to be unanswered. For example, whether or not the variants make any difference, how younger adults, when the vaccines become available, will take to getting vaccinated. If you vaccinate the older population, but you don't vaccinate the younger population, then you may have waves of younger population virus.
Sure.
And those are school-age kids' parents, and those are workers at businesses, et cetera. And so all of that are unanswerable questions at this particular point in time. And that's one of the reasons why the messaging from the public health perspective is so important. We talked about that earlier in the week with the Zeynep Tufekci article from Atlantic about what people are saying. There's every reason to be optimistic about the vaccines. They work, and J&J's one-shot deal is a big game changer, particularly if Merck helps them ramp up production. So all of that's on the good side, but we're not done with this yet. We are plateauing. And it's really unpredictable in terms of where it goes from this particular point in time. Are we going to drop from the plateau? Or are we going to increase in the plateau? How are decisions made by Greg Abbott and Tate Reeves and the other governors trying to open up going to make an impact on that, good or bad? All remain to be seen. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and all of that's going to have obvious interest and effects politically. It's just that people are so fixed in where they were for 4 years because of Trump doesn't mean that that's going to be the case when Trump is not on the ballot. 2018 was not 2020.
Well, that part was obvious, I think. I mean, the numbers changed.
The numbers changed. So people who are in the cult of Trump, do they show up in 2022? We'll see.
All right.
Anyway, that's
Vaccinate
my segment for today. That'll keep you busy.
Yeah, I guess so. I
got some laundry to do, so I
guess you do.
Stuff
to fold
do,
anyway.
Places to go.
Okay. I'm just sort of
and a dog to go rescue. He's been isolated outside for the moment.
Okay. Well, time to come in. Although it's supposed to be a nice mild day, but it's not warm enough yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So take care and good luck.
You
and I will talk to you tomorrow, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, right. Well, how about that? I predict that will happen, and that Democrats will get credit for it when you come on the show tomorrow. They should.
You
All right. Know. It's got my mind turning now. I'm beginning to see things taking shape in the in future claims of Republicans. I wonder when we better start pushing on the data on getting kids vaccinated. I assume that once they've taken care of all the adults, and there is some surplus vaccine on hand, and older teenage kids, families start wondering about getting them some vaccine too. And
well, this trial's going on now in infants, toddlers, and younger people. So by then we'll have some of the data to say it's safe and effective.
Well,
same
I hope
thing with
so.
pregnancy.
And that would be good news. I'd like to see that happen for my kids. I'm just thinking about Republicans, coming to the going on TV. First you said the kids don't get it. Now you say they got to be vaccinated. Make up your mind. Another one of those misinformation or misinterpretation of best available information from the early days comes back.
I think it's going to be more simple. It's going to be Republicans want to open up businesses and schools, and Democrats don't. And why are they closed?
Well, certainly that too.
And Democrats are saying, well, we wanted to vaccinate everybody first. And Republicans are saying, well, see, but they didn't open until we put pressure on you, so it's our doing. So that's what you can prepare for.
Well, that will probably happen too, and I think they can both happen in parallel. But okay, well, look, I'm glad that the trials are going on, because I'd like to see that happen, and I'm worried about. I've got kids right on the border there, who
hey, nobody's getting sick anymore. We're all vaccinated. You see, I told you it was a fake pandemic, and I said that at the beginning.
Only, right, they could only fake it for so long, a year and a half, until everybody got vaccinated. All right, better go take care of biz. It sounds like you got plenty to work on there. We'll see you tomorrow.
Well, it's Wednesday garbage day. So now that we finished with the laundry, we got to go collect the garbage. All right, take care, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.
Kitchen table issues. Right. Very good. Thanks, Greg. We stick to the basics of the agenda here. Okay, let's see. Much objection offered up by via Twitter to the assumption that I think was implicit in David Shore's. Was it David Shore's piece that we were citing for this, or was it maybe the 538 piece that first generated this point of discussion on the question of whether there would be political backlash, or whether Democrats or anybody, Republicans, would be how they would consider the minimum wage hike as impacting their districts or the country at large. The old tension, which may or may not be an outdated tension, between hikes in the minimum wage and the concurrent reductions in poverty rate, but the traditional economic analysis, the worry about an increase in unemployment rates as the cost of employing, the cost of employing workers at the lower end of the pay scale rises with a hike in the minimum wage. That very often, of course, the traditional economic analysis, companies will seek to balance the hike in per employee pay by reducing the number of employees that they're paying. Still, I think a large part of traditional analysis, but our good Twitter friend Bosengood, who reminds us that there are competing economic analyses that conclude that the impact on unemployment of a hike in the minimum wage isn't necessarily as traditional analysts have expressed it might be, though there's still plenty of traditional analysis around to counter that counter. So it's a matter for dueling experts and dueling reports. I think it's, generally speaking, the progressive view that the relationship may be more malleable. And I don't know, I guess you might even liken it to the emergence of modern monetary theory, in the sense that it too flies in the face of traditional economic analysis, which grows out of, I guess, the more, I guess it's not even all that appropriate for a macroeconomic analysis to grow that directly from microeconomic analysis. They are, after all, different fields, related, of course, but different fields. But it makes a certain amount of common sense, if not, even if it doesn't stand up to macroeconomic analysis. It makes microeconomic common sense to think, well, okay, if it costs more to keep an employee on the books, there will be fewer employees on the books. That's the generalized analysis, the generalized approach to these things. And similarly with modern monetary theory, right? If you put more money in circulation, that will be inflationary. And if you ignore the growth of the national debt and each year's federal deficit, then you'll put yourself in some kind of undefined trouble, because everyone knows that individuals and families, or even corporations, non-sovereign entities anyway, incurring large amounts of debt carries tremendous cost with it. But when you're talking about sovereign entities that can issue their own currency, the calculus may change, just as moving from microeconomic analysis into a macroeconomic question. Maybe microeconomic analysis doesn't apply all that well to macroeconomic situations. I don't know. All right. Well, beyond my bailiwick anyway, but not beyond that of all of you listening. So I appreciate your chiming in on all of that. Let's see. Some important breaking news out there as well. Marjorie Taylor Greene making a nuisance of herself. Who could have guessed that she would be doing this? I guess having lost all of her committee assignments has left her with lots of time to spend on the floor, which is an okay thing to do for a member of Congress. But she's learned one trick and one trick only, and that is to move to adjourn every time the House majority brings something to the floor that she doesn't like and wishes they wouldn't vote on and wouldn't be able to do. So she moves to adjourn, and then she's defeated by a solid majority voting no on her motion to adjourn, but time is wasted. So she's learned that though she has no committee assignments, she also doesn't really want to do any work on the floor and keeps trying to adjourn. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, there's more happening here by way of objection from among the listenership via Twitter. Let's see. One more point that I'd like to get on the record here. Our Twitter friend Mars Farmer 75 pointing out from Greg's discussion here. Let's see. He says, she says, I guess I actually don't know now that I think about it. But I'm not going to force you to put your pronouns in your profiles or anything like that. Not that I wouldn't pay attention to them if they did. I think I would honor them, but I might not remember to look very quickly. I think what's more important probably is the comment. So let's just get to that. I don't think, he says, I believe I've got it now, looking at the profile picture, I'm assuming gender from that because I still don't have real helpful and useful language. I got to go into, there's got to be some pronoun training out there somewhere to find a way to express this kind of thing without definitive knowledge of what pronouns people prefer. What's the neutral approach to this? I don't know. And I think the current working term is to just say they, and that's not right either. And I object to that on grammatical grounds. But okay, here's the comment. I don't think the analysis bears out that this is about defund the police. We're talking, I guess, here again about the Shore piece and the question of whether or not the more conservative-leaning minority voters who switched and went Clinton to Trump over issues of law and order. It says, I guess, the assumption was that perhaps the defund the police issue and the framing of it was what drove people to switch their votes. But Mars Farmer 75 says, I don't think the analysis bears out that this is about defund the police or other progressive issues. It's more about the failure of both parties to provide good jobs, health care, or improve wages. And that also is a good guess, but I don't know. I took the meaning of the Shore piece to be that, well, his analysis anyway does bear it out, because he's got data that suggests that the switch was in many cases more focused than the generalized issue of failure to provide good jobs, healthcare, or improve wages. Now, it may be the case that people want, for whatever reason, to blame it on defund the police or some other issue, or are offered that as an option and take it in surveys, versus a more generalized, well, it's about the failure of both parties to this, that, or the other thing. That's entirely true. They may misascribe their motivations. More study would absolutely be necessary. But I think the whole point of the Shore article was that, this is an analysis, and I am making it on the basis of data. You may disagree with the conclusion I reach, but what I'm trying to say here is that I have, not me, but Shore himself, analyzed the data and have drawn this conclusion. And, you got room to disagree, but it can't be that I'm just guessing. It's not the right conclusion, given the fact that I've gathered this data and analyzed it. I may have made a mistake in analyzing it, according to you, but I am making this as an analysis. All right. Other important piece of news. The Washington football team, still without a name, by the way, and isn't it time for them to fix this already? We're now in the off season. I would have thought they would have spent the better part of the season having somebody think of a name going forward, and I guess they didn't. And that's just indicative of, how poorly the organization is run since that idiot bought it. But I'm glad that he bought it, and I'm glad he's still alive and running it, because I really never liked that franchise, no matter what the name was. And I'm happy when they lose. Important news here that allows the Hill to tweet pictures of cheerleaders around, which is always a popular thing to do on social media. The Washington football team to feature a dance squad, but no cheerleaders in 2021. So no name and no cheerleaders. All the things that are bound to keep the relatively, I think, conservative leaning and reactionary crowd that considers themselves hardcore football fans, all the things that they tend to love about football and loyalty to their favorite football team. Cheerleaders surely help with that, although, it's a bit of a caveman kind of an attitude. But hey, but you'll get your dance squad, which is really, why is that not the same thing? Are you really just saying, well, is the only difference pom-poms, really? Why can't you dance with pom-poms? I don't know. So I'm not certain what the difference between a dance squad and cheerleaders is, and I'm sure there are dance squad enthusiasts who are aghast at that and will want to run some sort of corrective on the program. But hey, all you need to do is sit down with your smartphone and record that corrective, and we'll put it on the air. So at least you have that available to you. But I don't know. To me, I always thought, but we're always finding opportunities to challenge the conventional wisdom on these things. But my guess, I think, going into this would have been that football fans like their teams to have names. You see, I can't even function properly without knowing for sure what pronouns people prefer to be, how they prefer to be addressed, even though I won't require you to actually put it in your Twitter bio. I don't need to bother you with that. It's my problem if I feel guilty about not being able to do it correctly. Plus, it provides extra content. But really, I thought that one of the things about people and their football fandom was that they liked to, for instance, root for a team by name, or wear merchandise, perhaps declaring their loyalty to the team of some name. And it probably bothers them a great deal not to be able to have that. But the geniuses running the operation there say, yes, let's get rid of names and cheerleaders, not like things that concuss people and possibly cause their early death, but the important stuff. What will we call this group of people who are not doing all they can to avoid repetitive brain injury, for instance. But all right, that's where people have been spending their time. I can't help you explain that. All right. Now, one thing I would like to do is wrap up the segments that liberal thinking has provided for us on the American Rescue Plan before the Senate finishes up with this thing. Now, it could take them forever to actually get through this thing, but they haven't started voting yet, so I know we're still safe. We have segments 5 and 6 available to us. I listened through the two of them, and I'm going to roll the two of them pretty much back to back again, because that's, I think, the thing to do with them. And of course, it probably made more sense the way they were recorded for me to have done one per day, because a significant portion of each recording is reminding you of the story to this point, in case you have. So, for instance, when I play segment 6 after segment 5, you'll say at the beginning when Rich reminds you that he, represents a strong progressive viewpoint within the Democratic Party and supports the passage of the American Rescue Plan, you'll say, I know, you just told us a few minutes ago. But I think he originally planned these to be played once per day. So that's on me and not on him. But segment 6, I guess, well, I'm going to play it because it summarizes everything one more time, but I feel like it doesn't, we've gotten to the point where 6 doesn't add any additional material, but it was not supposed to. It was sort of supposed to be a wrap up of all 5. Let me roll number 5, and I'll follow it up with number 6. It only takes a few minutes. So we have Rich gets the chance to present his argument at least as he recorded it, if not necessarily as he intended it in being presented 2 at a time. But we'll get past that. Hang on. Rich, you ready? This is metaphorical, pretending he's here in the studio.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party. Previously, I suggested progressives support the American Rescue Plan, now pending in Congress, but with changes to better respond to the coronavirus and its economic aftermath. The plan has 2 provisions designed to help children. People love children, but most families in the country do not have minor children at home. These provisions penalize the majority of families. Most of the children in our country impacted by coronavirus are hurt because they live in poor families, not because they are children. We should focus on helping families in economic need, not just any family with a child. Congress should remove the provisions for child tax credits, earned income credits, and support for child care workers. Instead, we should fix the minimum wage and the tax code so that any person can afford to have a child on their own normal wages. The living wage for a single person with a child in most of the United States is over $25 an hour. We should set this as a target minimum wage. We need to support wages in this country by ending the trade deficit and by demanding an international minimum wage so that companies cannot undermine wages in the U.S. by manufacturing overseas. This, combined with a sensible domestic minimum wage, will make it much easier for people who want to have children to have them. At the same time, we should provide a tax credit to help those families with incomes that do not reach the living wage in their area. For example, the living wage in New York City is around $39.75 an hour. For an adult with a child, this is roughly $87,500 per year. No one living in Manhattan should be paying federal income tax for any income less than that. I recommend you go to the living wage calculator at livingwage.mit.edu and look up the living wage for a single person with a child in your area. If you're paying taxes on an income lower than this, talk to your representatives and demand to know why. The tax rates can be fixed through reconciliation. The American Rescue Plan should be focused on stopping the pandemic and rescuing the economy from the downturn caused by COVID. While we are passing it through reconciliation, we need to address some of the other critical problems. We should repeal the Trump tax cuts, increase the minimum wage with a target of $25 an hour, and provide tax credits for people earning less than the living wage in their area. Please join me in urging your representatives in Congress to make changes to this legislation so that it will better serve the country. You can find Enhancing the American Rescue Plan, along with other posts by Liberal Thinking, in the All Daily Kos Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, and so I'll roll the next one, and these are as good in reminding you that you can find worthwhile discussion of what I would describe as the things to be pushing for perhaps in the next round of legislative efforts, whether it's next year's reconciliation bill or at any other point, freestanding legislation or omnibus legislation between now and then, just because it will be, it's at this late date, less than likely that not only that we will be able to make some of those changes, but make the case publicly that would underlie or be necessary in order to pressure legislators to adopt some of the more ambitious of these changes. True. Now, that was an interesting point that Rich makes there. It actually kind of made me laugh a little bit in the way it was presented. Like, well, okay, the child tax credit. Everybody loves children. This sounds like a setup. Yeah, I mean, they do. And is that true? I mean, I guess it really probably could be true, but it seems out in the suburbs, it's hard to believe that well, most families don't have minor children living at home, but the demographics of the country being, skewing relatively young, especially under in among minority populations, it's hard to believe that you could skew that much younger and not have that many minor children at home. There are certainly countries that are more heavily skewed young, but maybe it makes a difference as between in demographics who's got minor children at home and who don't. But and that's going to be a tall order too, is kind of convincing everybody. As after all, we've all been programmed. Won't somebody please think of the children? That you need to think of them. Certainly, but think of them differently. And it's a good and fair point that just being a child doesn't mean you are in need of economic support necessarily. Being a poor child or being a poor anything, any age, means that, you probably could do with some economic support. And it ought to, so economic support ought to be based on that rather than your age, for instance. And it seems like a fair point. But, tall order politically to say, won't someone think of the children? Well, don't. Won't someone think of their socioeconomic status? Okay, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue. Anyway, segment 6 here wraps things up nicely, just reminding you once again, though it would be much more, I suppose, more useful if I did this on a separate day when you needed reminding of these things. But I think it's important to get it done, considering that voting will start on this on the floor in the Senate today. And wanted to roll it while it was still as relevant as possible, so let's do that.
Hello, this is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party.
He does.
Previously, I suggested progressives support the American Rescue Plan, now pending in Congress, but with changes to better respond to the coronavirus and its economic aftermath. I also suggested Democrats use this opportunity to not only pass an expanded minimum wage increase, but to also repeal the Trump tax cuts and to provide a tax credit for people not earning a living wage. What are the most important changes to this legislation? First, there should be monthly checks to every working age person not working full-time. Second, we should change the one-time payment to a monthly payment or eliminate it in favor of increasing other benefits and making them monthly. Third, Congress should focus on helping people in economic need rather than demographic groups. Along with the American Rescue Plan, we should also increase the minimum wage with a target of $25 an hour. We should repeal the Trump tax cuts. We should provide a tax credit for people earning less than the living wage in their area. We should fix our trade policy to support jobs and higher wages in this country. These other changes, along with the American Rescue Plan, should be passed through reconciliation in the Senate this month. Please join me in urging your representatives in Congress to make changes to this legislation so that it will better serve the country. You can find Enhancing the American Rescue Plan, along with other posts by Liberal Thinking, in the All Daily Coast Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you.
All right, and so now your opportunity is there. Do remember to drop by and engage in the discussion if you wish. And, of course, take this as a reminder that if you, too, would like to make such a contribution to the show in terms of the content, The opportunity is there. Sit down, record it on what you've got available. Send it to me and email it. Why not? Attach the file, Kagrox, Kagros, at gmail.com. Easy enough. And don't worry about the professionalism level or anything like that. Believe me, I like to help you out. If you're going to help me out, I'll help you out. I'll spend some time in the editor making sure that everything sounds as good as possible. Do some noise reduction. If you make a stumble in the presentation, if I can edit it such that it still makes sense or makes more sense by editing it than by not, then I'll go ahead and do it. And you'll come across sounding as professional and tightly produced as possible. If I were a real producer, I'd probably do a lot better at it, but I will help get those things on the air and sounding as good as possible. So, all right, I think we stand now at the point where we have to talk about what will actually be happening on the Senate floor in the consideration of this reconciliation bill and the various ramifications. I mentioned to you at the start of the show that I was going to thumb through the record, that being the congressional record, from the Senate's proceedings on August 6th, 1993, although it's going to take some time to actually find the spot here because I've just got the raw PDF of the day's proceedings. That includes not only the House proceedings, but also the Senate. And I've got to scroll all the way through just to find the Senate part. And then the part that is relevant to the discussion, the question of how many votes it takes to sustain a ruling of the chair when the chair rules that the Byrd rule does not apply to the situation in question. And a couple of things, I think we actually have hit upon one of them here. All right, yes. So, and I guess I should also point out the fact that this was happening in under slightly different circumstances. I think we're talking about, well, certainly it's a reconciliation bill under consideration in 1993, and the various things being included. I'm not even certain what some of the underlying issues were, but all that's important in this situation is, one, I guess top line importance, is that the chair has ruled, though presumably with the I'm trying to think now, because this might have been offered up as a example of the. No, I don't. I think it was originally offered up as an example of the chair ruling in opposition to the. No, I guess not. I think it was being brought up in the context of it being the chair overruling the parliamentarian, but that's not actually the case. I'm now reminded of the other controversy that swirls around this thing, which is the idea that only the vice president in presiding over the Senate is empowered to overrule the parliamentarian. That is not the case. We've stated it as fact, but not actually brought up any examples to show why that's the case. But I think that stems from a misunderstanding of what's available in the Wikipedia article about the parliamentarian of the Senate. The correct formulation is in there somewhere. I guess now I'll have to go and run over to take a look at that. Call that up for you. Parliamentarian of the Senate is written up in Wikipedia this way, and it's just a short paragraph that describes the role of the parliamentarian and who can overrule them. And it starts off well enough, but then there's a confusing conclusion to the paragraph that if you understand what the actual rule is, you'll be able to parse correctly. But if you're new to it, you will likely make a mistake. And it reads this way. As the presiding officer of the Senate may not be, and usually is not, aware of the parliamentary situation currently facing the Senate, a parliamentary staff sits second from the left on the Senate dais to advise the presiding officer on how to respond to inquiries and motions from senators. They give an example parenthetically, but that's not helpful. The role of the parliamentary staff is advisory, that is true, and the presiding officer may overrule the advice of the parliamentarian. So it says it point blank correctly right here. The presiding officer may overrule the advice of the parliamentarian, which, to those of you familiar with Senate proceedings or familiar enough with our discussion of Senate proceedings, they will know that that means that anybody who's in the chair can do this. And you will also know that very frequently just, rank and file senators are in the chair. Very often a very low ranking senator sitting in the chair because it's a tedious task, and it's while it's considered something of an honor to preside over debate in the House, it is considered an annoyance in the Senate. And of course, there are no worries about putting lower ranking senators in the chair, because when it comes to questions of parliamentary procedure, they will be being advised by the experts. And very rarely does anybody think that could or should overrule the advice of these parliamentarians. So then it goes on to say, after pointing out that the presiding officer may overrule the advice of the parliamentarian, it says, in practice, though, this is rare, and that is true too. And the most recent example of a vice president, parentheses, as president of the Senate, overruling the parliamentarian was Nelson Rockefeller in 1975. So that's meant to show how rare it is that presiding officers would overrule the parliamentarians. But it's said in this weird and ambiguous way. What they really ought to be saying in combination is that the role of the parliamentary staff is advisory, and the presiding officer may overrule the advice of the parliamentarian. And in practice, that is rare. And by way of example, it's so rare that the last time it was done by anyone was 1975. And it just so happens that the person who did it was Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, though anybody could have done it in 1975 or otherwise. What, in combination, and stated correctly, all it means is, okay, well, anybody in the position of presiding officer can do this. People usually don't. It's very rare. In fact, it's so rare that the last time it was done, it was in 1975. And in fact, it's taken so seriously when you get advice from the parliamentarian that not only is it rare to overrule the parliamentarian, but it implies that perhaps the only person who would have the confidence to go ahead and overrule the parliamentarian might be someone super important, like the vice president and constitutionally the presiding officer of the Senate, that rank and file senators, even the Senate president pro tem, even the majority leader, if he were for some reason to put himself in the chair, that never happens either, probably wouldn't feel very comfortable doing it. Nobody does, because it's rarely done, because the parliamentarians are usually quite correct about these things and call them more or less down the middle, no matter who it is that they've been appointed by. So it's a very serious undertaking, and not everybody wants to do it. But it should not be, the conclusion from this should not be, and for many, many people it has been, not because they're reading the Wikipedia article so much as they're reading the conclusions of other people that they trust, who may or may not acknowledge that they're getting their information from Wikipedia. But it seems pretty obvious that they are. And it's poorly stated here, and I think through the telephone game, we find that a lot of people are drawing the conclusion that only vice presidents can do that, and as a result, unfortunately, there is a movement on in social media to place the blame for Democrats not opting to overrule the parliamentarian on Kamala Harris's shoulders because she is the vice president. And I read somewhere, whether in Wikipedia or somebody who has put together an article on the subject based on what they read from Wikipedia or heard from somebody else who read it on Wikipedia, that only the vice president could do this. And maybe we were primed for it by the stupid Trump supporters who went around telling everybody that the vice president was empowered to overrule the electoral college results, which was also not true. Anyway, it's resulted in a lot of bad information and bad news for Kamala Harris. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We'll skip back now to the reason I was thumbing through the congressional record. And I guess to trace the provenance of all of this, there is, as I mentioned, and Greg referenced earlier in the week, and I think perhaps even last week, a theory under which the Democrats might have been able to engineer a vote that would have permitted the inclusion of a $15 an hour minimum wage provision in the reconciliation bill by circumventing the parliamentarians' recommendation on whether or not these provisions pass muster under the Byrd rule. And the theory goes like this, that if any presiding officer, vice president or otherwise, though you might want to have the vice president on hand to do this, not because it's necessary to have her in the chair to present this ruling, though it might be argued that perhaps the vice president, might be the only one that feels empowered to do this. It might be smart internal politics in the Senate to have a non-senator present this ruling so that we don't have the hard feelings, let's say, I don't know, to simplify things, against one senator against another for having presented this ruling, which would be contrary to the parliamentarians' advice. Though there are also, external politics, like maybe it would be best if the White House were not implicated in this maneuver, that in a way that might be the case if the vice president does this, presumably with the president's agreement, even though, so this would fall on the White House, or at least on the executive branch, even though, of course, the vice president doesn't live in the White House. But you know how these things work in American politics. And if you don't, because you're visiting us from outside the United States, well, just take my word for it. It would. That's all I can tell you. But so here's how the situation is supposedly thought to play out. And as strange as it is, it might actually play out this way. Though I don't know why, and it was probably a mistake to do it this way, but the precedent appears to be there. Okay, so the engineering would be the vice president or any presiding officer in answering the point of order, the Byrd rule point of order proposed probably by a Republican in this case, who says, all right, this minimum wage increase being included in the reconciliation bill, it represents, it's non-budgetary in nature according to the parliamentarian. We've all heard this. And yet, we haven't gotten to the ruling yet. So I would say make a point of order, this Republican would make a point of order that says this is contrary to the Byrd Rule. And the question then would fall to the presiding officer, who would ordinarily take the advice of the parliamentarian and say that is correct, the senator is correct, and the point of order is sustained. Now, that could be appealed by a Democrat who opposes removing this material from the bill, and then there would be a vote. But there, in this case, with this scenario, the vote would be on overturning the rule of the chair. The chair would be ruling on the authority, the authority of the Byrd Rule. And so it would require, and this makes a certain amount of sense, it would require a 3/5 vote, 60 votes in a full Senate with everybody present and casting their votes, 60 votes to overrule the chair and also the parliamentarian, because they've ruled in agreement with the parliamentarian. But, in effect, you're overruling the parliamentarian. But in reality, you're voting on whether or not to overrule the chair. And it should be a hard thing to do. If the Byrd Rule has any validity, and you can argue about whether it's a good rule or not, but the question is it a rule? Does it have it's embodied in statute, it's adopted and understood and operates as a rule within the Senate. In order to waive the rules, you would need some sort of supermajority. You don't have to, but that's the way the rules are written. It requires that because they didn't want presiding officers or parliamentarians overruled all the time by simple majority whims. This was remember that reconciliation is a weird construct, and it was built to be difficult. The reward for clearing all the difficulties is that you aren't subject to a filibuster because there's time-limited debate and all of that. But in order to, it was specifically designed to prevent just cramming anything you want. It wasn't meant to be a once-a-year free shot at circumventing the filibuster. It was meant to make difficult fiscal and financial decision-making simpler. But it wasn't meant to shield non-fiscal materials from the filibuster in the same ways that this was. These were supposed to be hard decisions. Cutting the debt, cutting the deficit, occasionally raising taxes in order to do that, cutting popular spending programs in order to do that. Those who formulated and wrote up the Budget Act and then formulated the Byrd Rule, all of this was meant to protect difficult situations from political manipulation. So, it comes as no surprise that they don't like it used for other purposes. Anyway, so if the chair rules in concert with the parliamentarians finding that the Byrd Rule applies, it would require 60 votes to say, well, nonetheless, we don't want it to apply, either by voting to overrule the chair or to instead waive the application of the Byrd Rule. There are two ways to get to the result you want, but both require 60 votes to get them done. Either saying, yes, the chair is correct, which would be, the honest and straightforward answer if you believe that the parliamentarian, had a reason to exclude this stuff. If you agreed with the reason but nonetheless wanted the substantive material in there, you could move to waive the Byrd Rule and say, Byrd Rule is correct, its application is correct, but nonetheless we want this in there. 60 votes will do it. Or if you genuinely believed, well, the chair and the parliamentarian are just wrong about this. Their interpretation of the Byrd Rule is incorrect, and I disagree with it, and I'd like to establish as precedent that they are incorrect. You could vote to overrule the ruling of the chair, and that too would require 60 votes. A different situation may arise if the presiding officer, either on his own or with prior agreement with senators and political leadership, says, I will rule the opposite. The parliamentarian in this case has said the Byrd rule applies, but I think it doesn't, either for political reasons but it's just my legal interpretation differs from that of the parliamentarian, and I will vote to say that it doesn't apply. The rule is misapplied here. The Byrd rule does not prevent the inclusion of the $15 minimum wage, for whatever my reasons may be, in this bill, despite the fact that the parliamentarian says it does. That sets up a different question, and a Republican might very well disagree and therefore vote or move to appeal the ruling of the chair. There wouldn't be any reason for a waiver vote here, right? The Republican wants to uphold and apply the Byrd rule to the minimum wage materials, even though the chair has said it doesn't apply. You would just simply have to say the chair is wrong, the parliamentarian is right, but has no authority here. But the chair is wrong, I move to appeal the ruling of the chair. So you would think that in this instance, you might think that because you're looking to impose fiscal discipline, presumably, I mean, it doesn't really, but the claim of, I oppose the minimum wage because it imposes fiscal discipline on the federal government would be a pretty hollow one. After all, the basis for not including it or not allowing it in the reconciliation bill is that it doesn't have significant direct budgetary impact on the federal government at all. But whatever, this is about political cover rather than what the rules are. A Republican would say, I think it's bad for the economy, the national economy, to raise the minimum wage in this way. I also think that that the language that would execute this change is extraneous material under the definitions of the Byrd rule, and that the chair is just wrong on this. So you might think that because it would, because it would make things more difficult, and that the spirit, supposedly, of the Byrd rule is to exclude extraneous material, and you're trying to uphold that exclusionary power, that it might not require a supermajority to do the trick. It might only require a majority, as it would in any other or most other instances in the Senate. Appealing the rule of the chair requires a mere majority to win, to prevail, just as a bare majority can sustain the ruling of the chair. But operating as we are in reconciliation and under the Byrd rule, the argument is, what's happening here, regardless of how you feel about the underlying question, what's happening is an appeal of the ruling of the chair. And the rules say that an appeal of the ruling of the chair on a question involving the Byrd rule during reconciliation proceedings requires a 3/5 vote to prevail. So it's possible, the theory goes, to say that the presiding officer overrules the parliamentarian and says the Byrd rule doesn't apply here, and that an appeal of the ruling of the chair would require 60 votes in the affirmative on the question of whether or not the appeal is well taken. That's how they would formulate the question, in order to prevail. So that failure of the Republicans to put together 60 votes to appeal the ruling of the chair would have the effect of defeating the appeal and leaving the presiding officer's ruling standing. The ruling being that the Byrd rule doesn't apply to the minimum wage provisions, which means it remains in place. And that might actually be the case. But of course, the reason that they're not pursuing this, I think, is that still leaves the question of, okay, will you pass this reconciliation bill now with this material in there? And if the answer, if yes is the answer of only 48 of the Democratic caucus and Democratic affiliated senators, then 48 doesn't pass muster, assuming that all 50 Republicans show up to vote against it, or at least 49 of them do. Then you've done this for nothing. and you've opened yourself up to, I guess, even though you were always open to it, this could always have been done. Republicans trying to shoehorn anything they want into the next reconciliation bill, which they probably will do anyway. So maybe you might as well do it now. But if you're not going to get the thing passed, then what's the point? Anyway, what's August 6th, 1993 have to do with any of this? That would be the last time. This doesn't have anything to do with vice presidents or presiding officers overruling parliamentarians. This has to do with using a point of order to validate the inclusion of material that was controversial. What makes these different, though? August 6, 1993, this happened twice by votes of 43 to 57, that rulings from the chair that materials objected to by Republicans as extraneous were ruled not to be extraneous, and that the Byrd rule didn't apply. And then the appeals of the ruling of the chair failed, and those materials remained in the 1993 reconciliation bill, and then Democrats went on to pass that. The difference between then and now, there are two things that are different. One, should be obvious right off the bat. The parliamentarians weren't overruled here. Their ruling was that these in provisions didn't violate the Byrd rule. Republicans were apoplectic about this and said you're issuing a partisan ruling, and many years later, maybe 20, in fact, they eventually had their revenge on this parliamentarian. But anyway, at this point, the Republicans lose the vote on appealing the ruling of the chair. And the important part of it is here. Again, this is how the question is put. The presiding officer says, the question is the appeal of the senator, in this case from Missouri, well taken? An affirmative vote of 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn is required for the appeal to be well taken, that is, to be sustained. And then they ask for the yeas and nays. The yeas, 43 votes to say that the appeal is well taken and should stand and be sustained. 57 votes no. Now, there's nobody amasses 60 votes here, but again, the way it's set up, that a 3/5 vote is required because that's an appeal under the Byrd rule, means, if I read this correctly, that you could set up the same situation here if you if you rule from the chair that the Byrd rule doesn't apply. Again, here the difference, though, I mean, it only makes a slight difference. We're not overruling the parliamentarian here in 1993. And there was also the issue, I'll just throw this extra curveball in there. This is taking place in the context of voting on the conference report for the reconciliation bill. In other words, the House and Senate have both done their initial work and passed reconciliation bills, but they were slightly different versions of the bill. So they went to conference, worked out a conference report that settled all the differences, and the conference report then goes to the House and the Senate for votes. And likewise, a reconciliation conference report is time limited and protected from the filibuster and all of those things. And here, material inserted in conference is challenged as being contrary to the Byrd rule. That shouldn't make any difference from the perspective of the parliamentarians' ruling, but it could. And here's how. The fact that they've gotten a reconciliation bill, which is always a tough haul, through the House, through the Senate, through conference, and presumably at this point the House may even also have approved the conference report, we're now at the point where material inserted in conference has the possibility of sinking the whole thing. And even if members of the Senate believe in good faith that this stuff that's been inserted in conference really does violate the Byrd Rule, and they don't want to set a precedent that things can, that a provision like this, that the Byrd Rule has the ability to sink the whole damn reconciliation bill after the House passed it, after the Senate passed it, after the conference finished, after the House has approved of the conference report, and right down to the last minute. On a technicality, you're going to take down the whole very important reconciliation bill. That's the sort of political pressure that it's easier to imagine making members of the Senate majority fold and say, I really disagree with this, but I can't be the one to sink this bill. But it's even more difficult to imagine, but I guess it can happen, that the majority at that point leans on the parliamentarian and says, listen, if you rule that this stuff violates the Byrd Rule, we're going to overrule you. And it's going to create all sorts of controversy, but we cannot have this bill fail at this late date, even though they only inserted this stuff at the end in conference, which is, hey, that's your fault. But it is conceivable. I don't know that this was the case. I don't know what the parliamentarian was thinking at this point in time. It was the old parliamentarian before this current one, Alan Fruman, who ultimately was responsible for this ruling. But for whatever reason, and I can't even see what the reason is, and I don't think he ever made the reason clear, but having read at least some of what was being voted on in the first of these appeals, it does look like, hey, I don't know why the current parliamentarian probably would have said this is out of order under the Byrd Rule. But they got the parliamentarian to say the opposite, maybe under threat. And maybe just because they said, if you don't do it, then you put us in the position of having to overrule you in order to carry this conference report across the line. And look, the Senate ranks are not going to let this reconciliation bill fail at this point in the process, no matter what happens. So you might as well take our invitation not to create controversy that will probably result in your firing and certainly in your being overridden on this question. And he said, I see your point. I think that, may be what happened here. But anyway, I guess the larger question is this something that you could carry forward now? And I think it would be very difficult for the current parliamentarian or any parliamentarian to look at what happened here and come to the conclusion that they misstated the procedural posture of these appeals back then, and that you don't need 3/5 to overrule the chair in order to apply the Byrd Rule, but you would need 3/5 to overrule the chair in order not to apply it. But it is possible to come to that conclusion based on, I think, the intent and the spirit of what the Byrd Rule was meant for. But you do have this precedent. In 1993, twice in a single day, the question was formulated for the Senate, probably on the advice of the parliamentarian, that overruling the chair, no matter why you want to do it, or in what direction overruling the chair will take you, whether in the direction of greater or lesser fiscal discipline, whatever that might mean, all appeals of the chair in the Byrd Rule context require 60 votes in the affirmative in order to prevail. So it depending on how you set this thing up, if you overrule the parliamentarian and then have somebody object to that outcome, it might in fact require 60 votes to reinstate the parliamentarian's interpretation of the application of the Byrd Rule. So, okay, right? The memo might be right, but it's of no use because all it does is allow the bill to go forward And then ultimately the question is put, will you pass the bill? And if only 48 people will say yes to it because they either disagree substantively with raising the minimum wage in the way the bill proposes, or two, are pissed off that they were forced into this bad position by parliamentary tricks to pass something that they don't agree with, and watched the Senate backhandedly, with less than a majority, vote to establish the precedent that this can be done all the time by either party, then they're not very likely to support final passage of the bill, and they're not very likely to come around to helping you when you need their help with perhaps limitations of the filibuster in the near future. So it's a delicate tightrope. A delicate path to tread and a difficult rope to walk, I guess. Now, on the other hand, in the short time that I've got left, I'll point out that there are plenty of people who believe and take Senators Manchin and Sinema at their word that there are no circumstances under which they would support the elimination of the filibuster. So what's the point about, if you think they'll be angry with you when you need them on the limitation of the filibuster later for some other Democratic priority that they might even believe in, but if they're not willing to put themselves out on the line to limit or eliminate the filibuster in order to pass the thing under any circumstances, then who cares whether you angered them earlier or not? That could be a valid point too. But Norm Ornstein points out that there are situations in which it might, in fact, be the case that you could get the votes of Manchin and Sinema to, if not eliminate the filibuster, at least curtail its power such that Democratic priorities might, in fact, be passable. And he writes this up in the Washington Post, and now we find ourselves without the time to read all the way through it, but I can, of course, assign it as outside reading or tell you we could discuss that tomorrow or Friday. And I think we probably ought to get around to reading the details of these things. But for purposes of wrapping up within our time limits today, I will just say this. What Ornstein is proposing here is that there are options under the current rules and current interpretations of cloture procedure and filibuster procedure that Manchin and Sinema might agree to cooperate with if the underlying legislation is to their liking, that would make it more difficult for Republicans to pull off and successfully complete or successfully exercise a filibuster that prevents the passage of this popular underlying legislation. We've discussed this before. There are rules on the books which are a real pain in the ass for everyone involved, but which would require an awful lot of work for Republicans to actually sustain this filibuster and outlast a determined Democratic caucus. And we can discuss what some of those rules are when we have more time for it. But essentially, there are ways to bring us back to the old hard to accomplish and hard to sustain talking filibuster that don't require changes in the rules. Some changes in the rules would make it easier to force that later on and to not put so much of the onus of enforcing it on the majority, which is a mistake, I think, in the design of cloture in general. But there are rules, for instance, that say that when a cloture vote is pending, no senator can speak for more than once in a single day on the pending measure and the pending cloture motion, and that that limitation essentially means you can filibuster for as long as you can physically stay on your feet, but then if you yield the floor for any reason, go to the bathroom, pass out, run out of things to say, whatever it is, you're not entitled to regain the floor. And so Republicans would have to, as a team, agree to rotate on the floor, and each one of them would have to hold the floor and stay there and speak for as long as possible. And you can keep, of course, as the majority leader, you can keep the Senate calendar-wise, technically on the same legislative day for more than, or for indefinitely, really, and certainly for longer than a calendar day. And so you can do that in order to exhaust everybody's opportunity to speak once they've yielded the floor back. But it means putting all other Senate business on hold forever in order to do that. And remember, that was something that they didn't want to do when the issue was bringing forth the rest of the Biden agenda and filling out the cabinet, et cetera, et cetera. But perhaps later on in the session, it's something they might try. We'll expand on this, I'm sure, and waste everybody's time and bore you to death Thursday and then Friday of this week, and maybe extend it into further discussion later on. But only this show affords you the opportunity to do that, even if it does limit it at the end to just 2 hours, which I think you think is probably pretty fortunate, right?
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, Justice Putnam is next with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and he has more than one story, you see. So he'll keep your interest, I think, much better than we maybe were able to do today. Lots to cover today, including Kayleigh McEnany back in the news, now called out for her Capitol riot lies. And what better reason to call her out, I ask you.